I used to believe that if you loved enough, there would be no need for secrets. My name is Seraphine Ward, and for 20 years I was married to a man everyone in Charleston called steady as a stone. Franklin Ward, a banker, a Sunday churchgoer, the kind of man neighbors trusted to feed their cats or fix a leaky pipe while they were away. He was polite, composed, never raised his voice. And yet, behind that calm exterior, there was a silence so heavy it swallowed my own. Our marriage looked peaceful from the outside, the kind of quiet most women would envy. But I've learned that silence isn't always serenity. Sometimes, it's suffocation dressed as love. Franklin had rules, always rules. He decided what I wore to church, what time dinner should be served, and even how I spoke in public. I convinced myself it was his way of carrying a man's instinct to protect. Over time, I began to disappear beneath the weight of his orderly life. I stopped working after the wedding because he said he earned enough for both of us. I stopped visiting my sister because he said family gossip drained the soul. Eventually, I stopped asking why. He loved routines, the same breakfast, the same drive to work, and every Friday evening, the same ritual, his fishing weekend at the lake. A private spot, he called it. A man needs his solitude, he'd add with a gentle smile, as if solitude were a privilege only men could afford. For years, I never questioned it. He would pack his tackle box, his flannel shirts, and drive off before dawn. Sometimes I'd wake up and find his side of the bed already cold. I used to imagine him sitting by the water's edge, the early mist curling around his shoulders, waiting for the fish to bite patient, disciplined content. But in quiet moments, when I was alone folding his shirts, I'd feel an unease I couldn't name. Why did he never bring me there? Why did he laugh it off whenever I asked? Why did his voice turn sharp the one time I pressed the question? He had never been cruel, just distant, like a man who lived behind glass. And I, foolishly faithful, mistook distance for dignity. The day everything changed was a Sunday late spring, sunlight pouring through the curtains like liquid gold. I was baking cornbread when the phone rang. The voice on the line belonged to a doctor from the county hospital. Her words came in fragments I struggled to piece together. Heart attack. Massive. We did everything we could. I remember standing in the kitchen, flour on my hands, watching dust dance in the light while my mind went completely still. Franklin was gone. Just like that, no goodbye, no warning, no second chance. They told me he'd died at the lake house. Alone. The same place he'd never allowed me to see. That night, the house felt unbearably quiet. I sat at the dining table, staring at the empty chair across from me, expecting to hear his usual small talk about the news or the weather. Nothing came. Only the faint ticking of the clock, marking the hollow space where his voice used to be. I thought grief would break me open, but what I felt wasn't pain. It was something colder, more confusing. Relief. And the guilt that followed it was unbearable. How do you mourn a man who never truly let you exist beside him? How do you cry for someone who trained you to be silent? I wept at his funeral because that's what widows do. But deep inside, I was crying for another reason, for the 20 years I had lost to obedience, to fear disguised as devotion, for the woman I had buried long before I buried him. People came up to me with condolences, their voices soft with admiration. "You were such a devoted wife, Seraphine. You must miss him terribly." I nodded and smiled, because that's what was expected. But inside, a whisper kept rising, one I had never dared to speak aloud. Miss him? Or miss the version of myself I never got to become? That night, I opened his wardrobe, touched the sleeves of his pressed shirts, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt empty, but aware. In that stillness, I understood something that chilled me. I hadn't just lost a husband. I had lost the illusion that my quiet life was built on love. And somewhere between that realization and the ticking of the clock, I made a silent promise to myself that I would go to the place he'd forbidden me, the lake, his sanctuary. Not to mourn him, but to meet whatever truth he had kept locked away. I didn't know it then, but the peace I felt that evening was the beginning of every fracture that would follow. If you've ever caught yourself wondering who you're really living for, subscribe and walk this road of awakening with me. After the funeral, I began sorting through Franklin's things. Grief, they say, is quieter when your hands are busy, but every drawer I opened felt like touching a life that never truly included me. His shirt still smelled faintly of cedar, his notebook still lined up in perfect symmetry, every page a record of order. He was meticulous even in death. Then, buried under a stack of insurance papers, I found a thin, worn folder marked Lake Property, Private. Inside were the deed, maintenance receipts, and several letters addressed to him at an address I had never seen. My hands trembled slightly. That was the same cabin he had guarded, like a secret for 2 decades. The one he said wasn't a place for me. For years I had obeyed. I'd folded the silence around me like a blanket, convincing myself it was peace. But now, something inside me stirred a quiet insistence that I could no longer ignore. It wasn't anger yet, not even curiosity. It was something deeper, older, a woman's intuition that truth was waiting for her somewhere she had been forbidden to go. So I drove. The road to the lake was narrow, lined with pine trees leaning in like old witnesses. Their branches whispered above my car as if they already knew what I was about to discover. The further I went, the denser the air became, heavy with the scent of earth and something metallic, like rain before a storm. I hadn't been to that part of the county in years. The world grew quieter there. No gas stations, no traffic, no sign of anyone at all, only the hum of cicadas and the occasional crow breaking the silence. When the lake finally came into view, my breath caught. The water was still, glass-like, reflecting the gray sky above. I remembered how Franklin used to say he found peace there. "It's where I think best," he once told me, with that half-smile that always felt rehearsed. I parked in front of the rusted iron gate and sat for a while, engine off, listening to my heartbeat echo in the emptiness. My fingers brushed over the old key I'd found in his dresser drawer. I didn't know if it still worked, but it felt like the last unspoken invitation he had never meant to give. The gate creaked as I pushed it open. The air was cool and damp. I walked up the gravel path, my shoes crunching against the stones, until I stood before the small wooden cabin, Franklin's sacred refuge. For a long moment, I simply looked at it. The house wasn't abandoned. The paint was fresh, the windows clean. A potted plant sat on the porch, alive and tended to. My stomach tightened. When I turned the key and opened the door, I expected dust, cobwebs, the smell of time gone still. Instead, I found life. Clothes hung neatly on a rack by the kitchen. A pot sat on the stove, still faintly fragrant with cooked stew. The dining table was set for 2, and near the window a small bicycle leaned against the wall, its red frame gleaming in the afternoon light. I froze. This wasn't a man's lonely hideaway. It was a home. My throat went dry. I stepped closer, heart pounding, trying to piece together what I was seeing. Maybe someone had broken in. Maybe the property had been rented. My mind scrambled for explanations, any that could make sense. Then I heard it. A woman's voice. Soft, casual, intimate. "Frank, you're back already?" The words cut through the air like a blade. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Her footsteps approached from the hallway light, unguarded. She appeared in the doorway a moment later. A young woman, her hair pulled loosely back, wearing a pale sweater that barely concealed the curve of her pregnant belly. When our eyes met, time seemed to fold in on itself. Confusion flickered across her face, followed by something like recognition, though we had never met. And in that suspended second, I understood everything without needing a single explanation. Franklin's fishing trips, his secrecy, the scent of a life that wasn't mine. All of it led here to this house, this woman, this lie that had been breathing behind my back for years. The room tilted. I steadied myself against the table, afraid my knees might give way. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Only silence, a silence thick with shared shock. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to call him every name he deserved, but no sound came out. Only a cold, hollow stillness spread through me, as if my body already knew what my mind refused to accept. I turned slightly, eyes scanning the room. The small vase of fresh flowers, the framed photo of a man's hand resting on a woman's shoulder, half hidden behind her hair. I didn't need to see his face to know. It was Franklin, the man who never let me fish with him, the man who swore that lake was just for peace. In that instant, grief died, replaced by something sharper clarity. It burned quietly, like frost. I understood then that some lies don't need to be spoken to hurt. They live in the spaces where truth was never allowed to exist. If you've ever stood before a truth that shattered your peace, subscribe and walk with me through what came next. Her name was Simone Hayes. She couldn't have been more than 28, with soft brown hair tied in a loose braid and a face that still held the gentle uncertainty of someone who believes in love. Her hands instinctively covered the curve of her belly, as if to protect what was left of her world. When I said the words quietly, almost mechanically, "I'm his wife," she froze. For a moment, the entire house seemed to stop breathing. The clock on the wall ticked once, and then even that sound disappeared. Simone's eyes widened, disbelief flickering into dread. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She stared at me as if trying to rearrange reality itself, as if my presence was an equation that refused to make sense. Then, like glass under pressure, she cracked. Her voice trembled. "He told me he wasn't married. He said he lived alone." Tears welled up, slow and heavy, slipping down her face without restraint. She sank into a chair and buried her face in her hands, her whole body shaking. I stood there, unable to move, not out of pity, but because I was staring at the living proof of my husband's double life. On the table beside her was a small wooden box. She reached for it with shaking fingers, opened it, and pushed it toward me without looking up. Inside were fragments of a world that had never been mine, photographs of Franklin and Simone at the beach, laughing beneath the sunlight, birthday cards with his handwriting, unmistakably neat, a dinner receipt dated just 2 weeks before his death, a white baby onesie printed with small blue stars. Every piece of it was a blade, and I took each cut in silence. I recognized his handwriting. I recognized his smile. But I didn't recognize the man in those photos. He looked younger there, not in age, but in spirit. The way he held her, the way he leaned in close, as if she were the only sound in the world. I had never seen that softness. Not once in 20 years. Simone wiped her face, her voice breaking. "We've been together 4 years. He said he traveled a lot for work. That's why he couldn't stay the whole week. We painted this house together. He said it was our future home. We even picked names for the baby." Her words were fragile, but honest. I could feel the truth trembling inside them. She had loved him the way I once had, completely, without suspicion. A bitter calm settled over me. I realized then that we were not enemies. We were mirrors, 2 women standing on opposite sides of the same illusion. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply lowered myself into the chair across from her, my palms resting on my knees, and listened to the slow collapse of a life I thought I knew. For a moment, I imagined Franklin watching us from some quiet corner of the room, 2 women, one carrying his child, the other carrying his ghost. And for the first time since his death, I felt something close to hatred. Not for Simone. For him. The man who divided love into weekends, who built one life on the ashes of another. There was a strange dignity in Simone's pain. She didn't deny, didn't excuse, didn't bargain. She simply sat there and let the truth burn her clean. I envied her honesty. When she finally spoke again, her voice was a whisper. If I had known, I would have left him. I swear. I believed her. Because she looked exactly like I once did, hopeful. Trusting, blind in the way only love can blind you. We sat in silence. The air in the room was thick with everything that couldn't be undone. On the mantel, I noticed a framed picture of the 2 of them at Christmas. He wore the same sweater I'd given him the year before, the one I thought had gone missing. That small detail felt cruelly poetic, as if he'd stolen not just objects from our home, but pieces of my own history. My chest tightened, but still no tears came. I had spent too many years crying in secret. I didn't have any left for him. When I finally stood, Simone looked up at me with swollen eyes. "What are you going to do?" she asked. The question hung between us like smoke. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the man we both loved no longer existed, not the way we believed. "He didn't die in that lake house," I said quietly. "He died long before that, I just hadn't realized it yet." Simone lowered her gaze, her hand still resting on her stomach. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was heavy with recognition. I looked around the room one last time, the flowers, the dishes, the echo of a lie so carefully lived, and I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't going to break down in front of another woman who had been broken just as deeply. I turned toward the door, my voice steady, even as my heart trembled. "Keep the photos," I said. "They belong to you now. So does the truth." And as I stepped outside, the air hit my face like a baptism, cold, honest, cleansing. I learned that day that some lies hurt longer than the truth ever could, because they steal not just your trust, but the years you can't get back. In the days that followed, I should have left. It would have been easier to walk away, to lock the door on that house, on that chapter, on everything that had cracked open inside me. But each night, when I closed my eyes, I saw her Simone, her hands over her belly, crying like someone who had lost her map of the world. And maybe, in a way, I saw myself. 20 years earlier, I had been that woman, young, hopeful, waiting for a man to mean what he said. I had believed in love the way some people believe in miracles. I had thought devotion could fix loneliness. I had been wrong. So the next morning I packed a small bag baby clothes my sister's daughter had outgrown, a few groceries, a soft blanket, and I drove back to the lake. When Simone opened the door, she looked startled, like she hadn't expected to ever see me again. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her hair unkempt, her breath short from holding back more tears. I didn't say much. I simply held out the bag. She hesitated, then took it with trembling hands. The moment she saw the tiny clothes folded neatly inside, she broke again quietly, without sound, just tears falling as she covered her mouth. I didn't try to comfort her with words. Sometimes, words are useless. I just stood there, letting the silence between us do the healing. In the following weeks, I returned a few more times. At first, I told myself it was out of decency, a moral obligation maybe. But the truth was, I was drawn back by something softer, almost maternal. The kind of compassion you feel when you've walked through the same fire and survived. We never talked about Franklin. There was nothing left to say about him. The only name that mattered now was the one still unborn. I helped her clean the house, prepare meals, and call clinics for checkups. She was too far along to travel easily, so I stayed close. We learned to move around each other quietly, like two ghosts sharing the same air. One evening, as she rested on the couch, I looked around the cabin, the photos, the furniture, the remnants of their life. For the first time, it didn't sting as sharply. I realized I wasn't here to punish her or myself. I was here to make peace with the truth. Franklin's lies had divided us, but our pain had made us sisters. A month later, I found a small apartment in Charleston, a modest studio with sunlight spilling through white curtains and a little kitchen that smelled of new paint. I told Simone she could move there after the baby came. At first, she refused. Pride and shame danced in her eyes like two frightened birds. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked quietly. I thought for a moment before answering. Because I know what it feels like to be left behind. And no one deserves to start over alone. Oh, that was all. No lectures, no pity, just truth. When her contractions came early one morning, she called me. Her voice was panicked, breathless, half-formed between pain and fear. I rushed to the hospital. The drive felt endless, like each red light was testing my resolve. Inside the delivery room, I held her hand through every wave of pain. She screamed, she cried, she cursed, but she never let go of my fingers. I whispered to her over and over, "Breathe, you're not alone." And when the baby finally arrived, a small, red, trembling miracle, I felt something inside me lift. It was as if part of my own grief had found a way to be born into light. She named him Eli, a name Franklin had once said he liked for a boy. But to me, that name meant something new, a beginning without lies. After she was discharged, I helped her move into the new apartment. We set up the crib, folded the baby clothes, and stood by the window for a long while, watching the city below us breathe. For the first time since Franklin's death, I didn't feel haunted. I felt free. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. A week later, Franklin's sister Brenda called me. Her voice was cold, sharp enough to draw blood. "You're shaming his memory, Seraphine," she said. "Helping her? You should be grieving, not disgracing him." I let her finish. Then, in the calmest tone I'd ever managed, I said, "If he deserves to be remembered, then remember him truthfully, not as who you wanted him to be, but as who he really was." There was silence on the line. Then she hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't even shake. For the first time, I realized I no longer owed explanations to anyone. That night, I sat beside Simone as she fed the baby. The small apartment was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of Eli's breathing. The soft glow of the lamp painted us both in gold. Two women, one broken by betrayal, one reborn by compassion, sharing a silence that no longer hurt. I touched the baby's tiny hand, and he curled his fingers around mine. That simple gesture felt like forgiveness. Franklin left behind betrayal, but I chose to turn it into kindness. Because sometimes healing begins not with revenge, but with grace. After helping Simone settle into her new life, I finally turned to rebuild my own. The first thing I did was sell the lake house that polished cage disguised as peace. I didn't go back for a last look. I didn't need to. That place had already taken enough from me: years, illusions, my own reflection. When the realtor handed me the final papers, I signed them without hesitation. My hands were steady, my heart quiet. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for decades. For so long, I had lived by Franklin's rules, believing obedience was the same as love. Now I wanted to live by none but my own. I began therapy 2 weeks later. It wasn't easy to walk through that door to admit I needed help, not for grief, but for the silence I had built around myself. My therapist, an older woman named Marjorie, had the kind of voice that didn't rush. She asked me questions I had avoided all my life. When did you first learn to keep quiet? What would happen if you allowed yourself to be angry? At first I had no answers. Anger for me had always felt dangerous, like a match I wasn't allowed to strike. But the more I spoke, the more I realized how deeply I had mistaken fear for harmony. I had spent years afraid of my own voice, afraid of disappointing, of being too much. Each session peeled away another layer. I cried sometimes not out of sadness but recognition. There were versions of myself buried under every "yes, dear," and every dinner served in silence. One evening, after a particularly hard session, I wrote in my notebook, "I don't want revenge. I just don't want to be afraid of myself anymore." Marjorie suggested I join a women's support group downtown, a small circle that met every Thursday in the basement of a community center. The first time I walked in, I almost turned back. The room was too bright, too honest. 10 women sat in a circle, coffee cups in hand, their faces soft but weathered with familiar pain. Divorce, abuse, control, silence, different stories, same echoes. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated. My throat tightened. I wasn't sure where to begin, how to describe 20 years of being erased so politely that even I stopped noticing. But then a woman across from me said quietly, "Take your time," and something broke open. The words spilled out, not loud, not theatrical, just raw. I told them about Franklin, the lake, Simone, the double life. I told them how I'd forgotten the sound of my own laughter. When I finished, there was no pity in their eyes, only understanding. It was strange and liberating, being seen without having to perform strength. That evening, I walked out feeling lighter, as if I had left a little of my old self behind, resting safely in that circle of women. Weeks passed. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was a slow climb with quiet victories. I cooked for myself, painted the kitchen walls a new color, changed the locks, changed the way I breathed. Sometimes I still woke up expecting the old patterns, waiting for his footsteps, his voice, his judgment. But then I'd look around and realize the silence was finally mine, not his, mine. One afternoon after a meeting at the center, I sat outside on a bench to drink my coffee. The day was soft, the kind of early spring sunlight that forgives everything it touches. I watched people passing by, ordinary and alive, and for once, I felt I belonged among them. That's when he appeared. A man around my age, tall, with gentle eyes and hands that seemed used to fixing small things. He nodded politely and asked, "Mind if I sit?" His name was Thomas Miller. "A widower," he said. He'd been attending a grief counseling session upstairs. He didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. He didn't fill the air with pity. We just sat there, talking about nothing and everything, the weather, books, the taste of bad coffee. At one point he looked at the sky and asked, "Do you think it's beautiful today?" Such an ordinary question, Yet I couldn't remember the last time someone had asked what I thought, not what I was expected to think. In the weeks that followed, I often saw him again after meetings. Sometimes we'd talk, sometimes we'd just share the silence, a silence that no longer felt heavy. He never made me feel like I had to shrink or explain myself. He didn't try to fix me, didn't offer hollow promises. He was simply there. And maybe that's what real companionship is, not someone who fills your emptiness, but someone who quietly respects it. That night, as I wrote in my notebook, I realized something simple but profound. Healing isn't about becoming who you were before the pain. It's about becoming someone who can live with the truth and still find peace in it. For the first time in my life, a man's silence didn't control me, it comforted me. Time, I've learned, doesn't erase pain. It teaches you how to hold it differently. Months turned into years, and my life with Thomas unfolded like a quiet morning. No grand declarations, no fevered promises, just a gentle rhythm that asked for nothing more than presence. We didn't rush toward the future. We simply lived it, one steady breath at a time. Thomas never tried to fix me, and maybe that's why I began to heal. He didn't need to be the hero of my story, only a witness who stayed. We married on a mild spring afternoon, in the backyard of a small garden behind our house. No orchestra, no veil, no crowd, just a few friends, white flowers in mason jars, and laughter soft enough to feel like prayer. Simone was there, her son Eli perched on her hip, now old enough to say my name. "Aunt Sarah," he called out, running to throw flower petals across my dress. His laughter was bright and unburdened, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something born out of betrayal could grow into something so pure. When I looked at Simone radiant, calm, alive, I realized we had both survived the same storm and somehow ended up standing under the same light. After the ceremony, Thomas and I stood together beneath the oak tree, watching the guests drift away. The air smelled of earth and rain. He reached for my hand and squeezed it, not as a claim, but as a quiet reassurance that neither of us was alone anymore. I thought of Franklin then, not with anger, not even with sorrow, but with the kind of detachment that comes only after deep acceptance. There was a time I thought forgiveness meant forgetting, but standing there, sunlight pouring through the leaves, I finally understood. Forgiveness isn't erasure, it's choosing not to carry the darkness any further. Franklin had written the first chapters of my life with control, with silence, but the ending, this peace, this freedom, was entirely mine. Thomas and I built our days around simplicity. Coffee before sunrise, walks to the market on Saturdays, reading side by side in the evenings while the house filled with the smell of bread baking. Nothing spectacular, but every moment felt whole. I had spent years mistaking intensity for love, the ache, the sacrifice, the need to be chosen. With Thomas, love was something quieter. It didn't demand, it didn't consume, it simply was. He once said, while fixing a loose window latch, "Love's not about holding tighter, Sarah. It's about standing still and letting someone else breathe next to you." That line stayed with me not because it was poetic, but because it was true. Simone and I remained close. She lived only a few blocks away. And on warm afternoons, we'd watch the children play in her small yard, Eli, chasing after my two little ones, laughter weaving between the houses like wind through tall grass. To anyone passing by, we looked like family. And in many ways, we were. I often thought about how life had rearranged itself, how two women who once shared heartbreak could now share hope. Franklin had broken us both, but in the ashes of his deceit, we'd found sisterhood, compassion, and a quiet kind of redemption. Every so often, I'd catch myself reflecting on the woman I used to be, the one who stayed silent to keep the peace, who folded herself smaller to fit inside someone else's shadow. I didn't resent her anymore. I understood her now, her fear, her longing, her desperate belief that love was something to earn. But that woman was gone. I had learned to live differently, to speak, to choose, to exist without apology. One evening, after tucking the children into bed, I sat on the porch, watching the sun melt into the horizon. The sky burned with gold and rose the same colors that painted the lake years ago, the same place where everything had fallen apart. But tonight, there was no bitterness, only peace. I whispered to the wind, not for Franklin, but for the version of me who had once believed she'd never survive him. "You made it. You found your voice." Oh. And in that moment, I felt something lift the last remnants of sorrow, dissolving like mist at dawn. They say love is about holding on. But I've come to believe that real love, the kind that lasts, is about knowing when to let go. I used to think love was about holding tight, but the truest kind of love is learning to release so both souls can be free.